By the spring of 1944, Adolf Hitler stood over a map in his war room, scanning the French coastline with almost frantic concentration. Despite the catastrophic defeats in the east, despite the relentless bombing campaign that reduced German cities to rubble, despite the tightening blockade that was cutting off vital resources, Hitler believed he saw an opportunity. The Western Allies were coming. Everyone knew it. And Hitler was waiting for it. His logic was simple, almost childishly optimistic. Let them come? Fortify the Atlantic Wall. Crush them on the beaches. Throw their shattered armies back into the sea. Then, with the West protected, move every available division east and finish off the Soviet Union once and for all. For Hitler, D-Day would not be a disaster. It would be Germany's salvation. The decisive battle would turn the tide of the war. He couldn't be more wrong. The story of why the Nazis failed on D-Day is not simply a story of Allied superiority. Although that played a significant role, it is a story of egos, misunderstandings, and disastrous decisions at the highest levels of German command. It is a story of brilliant commanders handcuffed by an increasingly unstable dictator. And it is a story of brave German soldiers, many of them teenagers and old men. Thrust into an impossible situation by leaders who could not agree on how to defend their conquered empire, to understand Germany's defeat, we must first understand the man tasked with stopping the invasion. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, hero of North Africa, arrived in France in early 1944 to inspect the Atlantic Wall. What he saw horrified him. The long-vaunted fortress of Europe was a propaganda stunt. Yes, there were concrete bunkers and gun emplacements. Yes, there were beach obstacles and minefields. But the defenses were incomplete, undermanned, and in many places completely inadequate to the task at hand. Rommel knew the Allies well. He had fought them in the desert, had seen their material wealth, their air power, their overwhelming capabilities. He knew that once they established a beachhead, once they had logistics, Germany would be crushed by sheer force of resources. The only chance, the only hope, was to stop them on the coast, destroy them on the beaches before they could dig in. It had to be done in the first hours, or at most the first day. And so Rommel threw himself into strengthening the defenses. He laid millions of mines. He ordered explosives to be placed on beach obstacles. He reinforced bunkers and artillery positions. He ordered every possible landing site to be turned into a battlefield. But Rommel understood something else, something very important. He knew that the Allies controlled the skies. In North Africa, Rommel had seen Allied fighter bombers reduce German formations to burning rubble. He had seen supply convoys wiped out from the air. He knew that any German movement during daylight was suicidal, and that meant the panzer divisions, the armored fist of Germany, needed to be positioned close to the beaches, close enough to counterattack immediately, before Allied air power could deploy, before the landing forces could consolidate. This is where Germany's problems really began. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, Commander-in-Chief of German forces in the West, completely disagreed with Rommel's assessment. Von Rundstedt was old school, a product of the previous war. He believed in defense in depth, keeping the panzers off the coast so they could maneuver freely, waiting to see where the main Allied attack would come before committing them to battle. General Geyer von Schweppenburg, commander of Panzer Group West, agreed with von Rundstedt. Hold the armor in reserve. Let the Allies land. Let them reveal their intentions. Then concentrate their forces on the key point. It was sound military doctrine, an approach that had worked for the German army time and time again. But it was the doctrine of a different war, one in which Germany controlled the skies. Rommel argued his case. He argued that Allied air superiority changed everything. He showed them intelligence reports on the capabilities of Allied fighter bombers. He explained that any attempt to move the panzer divisions during the day would result in their destruction long before they reached the battlefield. The armor needed to be close, needed to be ready to attack at a moment's notice. The debate raged for months, consuming precious time that should have been spent preparing. Neither side was willing to budge. Von Rundstedt and von Schweppenburg had experience and military tradition on their side. Rommel faced the harsh realities of modern warfare. In the end, the debate came down to the only man with the final say, Adolf Hitler. Hitler's decision sealed the fate of Nazi Germany on D-Day. Unable or unwilling to choose between his commanders, Hitler struck a compromise that pleased no one and doomed the Nazi response. Of the 10 armored divisions in the West, Rommel would have 3, positioned relatively close to potential landing sites. Von Schweppenburg would have 4, held in reserve. The remaining 3 divisions would be sent to southern France as part of Army Group G. But there was a problem that would prove disastrous. Panzer Group West, 4 reserve divisions, could only be deployed with Hitler's personal permission. Not von Rundstedt's, not Rommel's. Hitler himself would have to approve their use. For a military force trying to respond to a large-scale seaborne invasion, this was a command and control nightmare. The compromise was tactically flawed and strategically stupid. It divided the German armored reserve, the only force capable of repelling an invasion, into scattered groups under different commanders with different missions. Worse, it placed the decision to mobilize the main reserve in the hands of a man hundreds of miles away, a man increasingly making decisions based on intuition and ideology rather than military reality. As spring turned to summer, Allied landing forces massed in Britain. The Germans knew it was coming. Intelligence reports confirmed the massive troop buildup. Reconnaissance flights, when they could get past Allied air cover, showed ports packed with ships and landing craft. The question was not if, but when and where. And here the Germans were the victims of one of the most successful disinformation campaigns in military history. Operation Fortitude convinced German intelligence that the main invasion would take place at the Pas de Calais, the narrowest point of the English Channel. It made perfect sense. Calais was closest to England. Calais was the shortest route to Germany's industrial heartland. A completely fictional army, with fake radios and fake equipment, seemed to be massing on the other side of Calais under the command of General George Patton. The ruse worked brilliantly. The German High Command was convinced that if Normandy were attacked, it would be a diversion. The real blow would be against Calais. This belief persisted even after the Normandy landings began, paralyzing German decision-making at the crucial moment. Rommel himself was not immune to this deception. Although he fortified Normandy, he believed Calais was the more likely target. On June 4, 1944, the weather turned bad. Strong winds churned the English Channel. Rain lashed the south coast of England. For the Germans, it was perfect. No invasion could take place under such conditions. Exhausted by months of frantic preparations, Rommel decided to visit his wife in Germany for her birthday. Other senior commanders were taking part in an exercise designed, ironically, to practice responding to an Allied invasion. All agreed that the weather made an attack impossible for at least a week. They were wrong. Allied meteorologists detected a brief period of slightly better weather on June 6th. The weather conditions were not ideal, but perhaps good enough. Eisenhower, the Allied commander-in-chief, faced a painful decision: delay any longer and risk discovery. Advance in bad weather and risk disaster. After hours of deliberation, Eisenhower gave the order. The landings would take place on June 6th. As the mighty Allied fleet steamed towards France under cover of darkness, the German coastal defenses had no idea what was coming. Inclement weather meant patrols were reduced. The absence of senior commanders meant a slower response. And diversionary operations meant that even when the first reports did arrive, they were initially not believed or understood. Shortly after midnight, British and Canadian paratroopers began landing east of what would become Sword Beach. Their mission was to seize the bridges over the Caen Canal and the Orne River, protecting the eastern flank of the landings. Despite scattered landings and chaos, they achieved their objectives in a series of small, daring operations. At Pegasus Bridge, the paratroopers took the defenders completely by surprise, overwhelming them in minutes. But holding the bridges against German counterattacks was another matter entirely. The lightly armed paratroopers had no anti-tank weapons capable of stopping German tanks. They had the PIAT, the Projector Infantry Anti-Tank Gun, essentially a shoulder-mounted mortar that could fire a large explosive charge at enemy vehicles. It was better than nothing. But using it effectively required getting dangerously close to enemy tanks and hoping the round would hit at the right angle to penetrate. When the German tanks finally reached Pegasus Bridge, the situation became dire. The paratroopers grew increasingly nervous as the tanks approached. Then Sergeant Wagger Thornton, with the PIAT, maneuvered into position. He only managed to fire one shot. The arcing trajectory made accuracy nearly impossible. If the bomb ricocheted or hit at the wrong angle, the tanks would simply shrug and the Germans would be over the bridge. Thornton fired. The PIAT hit, and the lead tank burst into flames. The Germans, certain they were facing anti-tank guns and not a lone soldier with a shoulder-mounted grenade launcher, stopped their advance. That single shot, that moment of courage and luck, held the bridge. It was a miniature version of D-Day, individual acts of heroism, aided by German confusion and hesitation, would be decisive. To the west, the American paratroopers of the 101st and 82nd Airborne Divisions were having a much harder time. Dark clouds over the Cotentin Peninsula had scattered their drops in disarray. Entire units were scattered across miles of French countryside. Some drowned in flooded fields. Others were shot while hanging helplessly from trees. Unit cohesion collapsed into chaos. But chaos could go both ways. The scattered American troop drops caused chaos across the German rear. Reports of paratroopers were everywhere, attacking from all directions. German commanders had no idea where the main threat was or how many troops they were facing. Small groups of American soldiers, often drawn from different units, began to achieve their objectives by improvisation and attack. Sergeant Floyd Corrington jumped into this whirlwind at 1:20 a.m. We know he was wearing a helmet, bearing the insignia of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment. We know his C-47 transport plane carried his platoon leader. We know he was ordered to land at Drop Zone C. And we know he died on D-Day, his body found near where he was supposed to land. Between his jump and his death, Corrington's story was lost to history, one of thousands of personal tragedies that made up the larger story of D-Day. By dawn, the air and naval bombardment of the Normandy coast had begun. The firepower was terrifying. Battleships and cruisers fired 100-pound shells at German positions. Bombers carpet-bombed suspected strongpoints. To the German defenders huddled in their bunkers, it must have been apocalyptic. The ground shook. Concrete cracked. The noise was deafening, but the bombing, while impressive, was less effective than the Allies had hoped. Many bombs fell far inland, missing coastal defenses entirely. Naval fire, while accurate, failed to destroy every bunker and artillery position. When the bombing ended and the first waves of landing craft hit the beaches, many German strongholds were still intact and ready for battle. At Utah Beach, the Americans were lucky. Strong currents pushed the landing craft south of their intended beach, putting them in a poorly defended area. Quick-thinking commanders recognized this advantage and exploited it. By 10 a.m., Utah Beach was safe with only 197 casualties. It was the most successful of all the D-Day landings. At Omaha Beach, just a few miles to the east, the Americans were in hell. Everything that could go wrong did. The DD tanks, the amphibious tanks that were supposed to provide fire support, were deployed too far from shore in rough seas. 27 of the 32 sank immediately, killing their entire crews. The few that made it ashore arrived too late to support the initial assault. The infantry fared little better. Strong currents pushed landing craft off course. Some crashed into the sand, forcing men to wade neck-deep in water while machine gun fire tore up the beach. Others were swamped, drowning men carrying their gear. Those who made it to the beach found themselves pinned down by deadly fire from German positions on the cliffs above. The German defenders at Omaha, though outnumbered and outgunned, fought with desperate courage. The MG-42 machine gun, firing more than 100 to 200 rounds per minute, became a symbol of German resistance that day. Its distinctive sound, described as the sound of tearing canvas, marked the death zones on the beach. German artillery, protected by concrete bunkers, had perfect range on all approaches. The beach escape routes, narrow slits cut through the cliffs, became death traps. The situation in Omaha stalemate continued for hours. General Omar Bradley, watching from offshore, considered abandoning the beach and moving reinforcements to Utah. Bodies piled on the sand. The surf was red. Landing craft burned. It seemed impossible to advance against such fire. But slowly and painfully, small groups of men began to move. Gaps in the German defenses were discovered and exploited. Bangalore torpedoes tore through barbed wire. Brave men with flamethrowers and explosives attacked bunkers at close range. Through sheer determination and sacrifice, the Americans fought their way off Omaha Beach. By the end of the day, 34,000 men had landed, with more than 2,400 casualties. It was the bloodiest of all D-Day beaches. A near disaster turned into a costly victory. On the British and Canadian beaches to the east, Gold, Juno, and Sword, the landings went considerably better than at Omaha, though by no means easy. The British had learned the hard lessons of previous amphibious operations, especially the disastrous raid on Dieppe in 1942. Those lessons were now put into practice with the specialized armor the Americans lacked at Omaha. The funny tanks, as they were affectionately known, were the brainchild of Major General Percy Hobart. They were modified tanks designed to solve the specific problems that assault forces would face. The Churchill Averier E carried a large spigot mortar instead of a conventional cannon, capable of firing high explosive charges that could destroy bunkers and fortifications. Other variants carried fascines, huge bundles of wood that could fill anti-tank trenches, or spools of thread that spread canvas mats over soft sand to help vehicles cross beaches. At Sword Beach, the largest naval bombardment fleet of the 5 beaches pounded the German positions. As the first waves hit the beach, most of the DD tanks reached safety, almost as fast as the infantry. The sight of the tanks rising from the sea must have shocked the German defenders. Suddenly, the infantry had mobile firepower to support and assist their advance up the beach. These antics proved their worth immediately. Averys smashed barricades and pounded enemy positions with artillery mortars. Bridgemen dropped spans across trenches. Tank artillery detonated mines with their rotating tracks, although many were hit and destroyed. Survivors dismounted and continued clearing barricades by hand. Within 2 hours, 7 of the 8 beachheads at Sword were open. By the end of D-Day, nearly 29,000 troops had landed. But success came at a cost. German Camp Cod, one of several defensive positions along Sword Beach, took 3 hours to capture. The two attacking battalions suffered 25% casualties each. Young soldiers bled and died as they took turns taking bunkers in close quarters fighting with grenades, flamethrowers, and bayonets. War, even when it went according to plan, was costly. At Juno Beach, Canadian troops faced perhaps the fiercest resistance ever encountered on British and Commonwealth beaches. The landing coincided with high tide, reducing the beachhead and exposing troops to concentrated fire. Nevertheless, the Canadians fought with fierce determination, fighting house to house in coastal towns. By the end of the day, they had advanced further inland than any other Allied force on D-Day. A remarkable achievement, but one that came at the cost of heavy casualties. By mid-morning on June 6th, the Allied landings, despite setbacks and heavy losses in some areas, had succeeded beyond anyone's wildest expectations. The mighty Atlantic Wall had been breached. Thousands of troops had landed and pushed inland. And incredibly, the main German armor had yet to respond. Where were the panzers? This is where the German command failures became catastrophic. The 21st Panzer Division was the only German armored unit within direct striking distance of the beaches. But the division commander was away on exercises. As reports of the invasion began to circulate before dawn, confusion arose. Were the reports accurate? Was this an official invasion or a diversion? Who had the authority to order a counterattack? Hours passed in chaos and indecision. When the 21st Panzer Division finally began moving toward the coast, it did so piecemeal, without adequate reconnaissance and without support from other units. That afternoon, they managed to push their way between the British and Canadian forces, actually reaching the coast in a display of tactical skill and aggression. For a brief moment, the German tank crews could see the mighty Allied fleet offshore. They had broken out to sea, but the attack was unsupported and ultimately futile. Allied gunboats, directed by shore observers, began pouring heavy shells into the exposed German tanks. Fighter bombers roared down to attack the formations. British anti-tank guns, now firmly planted, attacked from multiple directions. Confused by conflicting orders and outgunned, the 21st Panzer Regiment retreated, losing more than half of its 124 tanks without making any strategic gains. This small, uncoordinated attack was the only significant German armored response on D-Day itself, and it illustrates clearly why Germany failed. The 21st Panzer Regiment attacked alone because the rest of the German armor could not join in without Adolf Hitler's personal permission. And on the morning of June 6th, Adolf Hitler was still sleeping. The Führer had worked late the night before, with strict orders not to be disturbed. The staff, terrified of his terrifying rages, had allowed him to sleep even as reports of the invasion poured in. By the time Hitler was finally roused and briefed, it was late afternoon. Precious hours. The golden hours when a concentrated armored counterattack could have pushed the Allies back to the sea, had been wasted on a man's sleep schedule. Hitler's reaction, when it happened, was remarkable. He reacted with jubilation. At last, the Allies had committed. Now they could be destroyed. But Hitler, like von Rundstedt, still believed that the Normandy landings were a diversion. The real invasion, the main attack, would come at Calais. He refused to commit his panzer reserves to Normandy. They needed to be held back for the real battle that was sure to come. This was the genius of the Allied diversionary campaign, which came to fruition at the crucial moment. Even as thousands of troops landed on the beaches of Normandy, even as naval gunfire rang out from the French coast, Hitler convinced himself that this was not the main event. The units of Panzer Group West were finally liberated, but it was too late. The Allies had landed in force. Their logistics were running smoothly, and their air superiority made any German movement a nightmare. The tragedy for Germany was that it had the forces to stop the invasion. The panzer divisions in France were experienced, well-equipped and led by talented commanders. But they were fragmented, divided between competing commanders with different strategies, and ultimately controlled by a dictator increasingly out of touch with military reality. The compromises Hitler imposed on his commanders meant that Germany's response to the largest invasion in history was hesitant, disjointed, and too late. On June 7th, the day after D-Day, the situation in Germany worsened. Panzer Group West tried to push toward Normandy to launch a long-delayed counteroffensive. But now it faced the full might of Allied air power. Fighter bombers, with complete air superiority, swooped down on German formations like hawks on mice. Vehicles burned. Soldiers died. Roads became graveyards of destroyed equipment. The Germans quickly realized they could only move at night. But moving at night with poor maps in unfamiliar territory slowed the German advance. What should have taken hours dragged on for days. Meanwhile, Allied troops, tanks, and supplies continued to arrive. The already slim chance of a successful counterattack now slammed shut. The French resistance added to Germany's troubles. Railways were sabotaged. Bridges were bombed. Telephone lines were cut. German units were isolated, unable to communicate or coordinate. In some cases, resistance attacks led to brutal reprisals against French civilians. The 2nd SS Panzer Division, Das Reich, marching from southern France to Normandy, murdered 642 civilians in the village of Oradour-sur-Glane in retaliation for resistance activities. Such atrocities achieved no military results and showed the moral degradation of the regime for which German soldiers were fighting. As the German counteroffensive finally gained strength, the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend stepped in. The division was unique and in many ways embodied both the fanaticism and the tragedy of late-war Germany. The division's soldiers were recruited from the Hitler Youth, 17 and 18-year-old boys who had been indoctrinated into Nazi ideology from a young age. They were led by seasoned veterans of the Eastern Front who had survived the brutal battles of the Russian campaign. The combination produced a fighting unit with a nearly suicidal spirit. On June 7th, D-Day +1. The 12th SS Panzer Division attacked the 3rd Canadian Division. The young German soldiers advanced with reckless courage, determined to push the Canadians back to the sea. They had been promised that a single, powerful attack would defeat the invasion. They believed that the superior German will and fighting spirit would overcome the Allied material advantage. But they were wrong on every count. The Canadians were ready. Their division was reinforced with double the usual field artillery. They had as many gunners in their battle formations as infantry, a staggering concentration of firepower, as German tanks and infantry emerged from cover to attack. The sky fell before them. Shells, some fired from self-propelled guns like the Sexton, rained down with mathematical precision. Forward observers called the bombardment with calm professionalism, adjusting the rounds until they hit their mark. But artillery was only part of the defensive firepower. Allied warships offshore added massive guns to the barrage. Shells the size of small cars roared in from miles away, obliterating German positions. Fighter bombers, enjoying their air superiority, circled overhead like predators, swooping down on any German tanks that came their way. The young men of the 12th SS Panzer Division, for all their courage and fervor, found themselves in a battle where mere bravery counted for nothing. The attack stalled, then collapsed. German tanks burned across the Normandy fields. The elite division tasked with pushing the Allies back to the sea was forced into a defensive position. When the Panzer-Lehr Division arrived on June 8th to join the attack, the battle was lost. Instead of counterattacking, these armored formations were left desperately trying to hold back the expanding Allied bridgehead. The contrast between what Germany needed to do and what it could do was stark and damning. To defeat the invasion, the Germans needed to rapidly mass their armor and pound the beaches before the Allies could establish a base. Instead, they spread their panzer divisions into the field, one or two at a time, where they were destroyed or crippled by overwhelming Allied firepower. It was exactly the scenario Rommel had warned of, and exactly what the compromised command structure ensured would happen. By June 12th, the Allies had captured the town of Carentan, linking the 5 landing beaches into a continuous front. The beachhead was now 80 kilometers wide and several kilometers deep. Thousands of tons of supplies poured ashore every day. The Allies had more than 300,000 troops in Normandy, and more were arriving every day. Any Nazi hope of pushing the invaders back to the sea had vanished. Hitler's grand plan had failed utterly. The massive counteroffensive that was supposed to push the Allies back never materialized. The decisive victory that would have freed Germany to turn east and crush the Soviet Union never came. Instead, Germany now faced exactly what Rommel had feared most, a brutal battle of attrition against an enemy with virtually unlimited resources, fought under skies controlled by Allied aircraft, supplied by a logistics system that Germany could neither match nor seriously disrupt. The question is not just what happened to Germany on D-Day, but why defeat was so clear and predictable. The answer lies in the many layers of dysfunction that plagued the German war machine in 1944 on a strategic level. Hitler's insistence on holding on to every inch of territory he had conquered meant that the German army was stretched incredibly thin. 58 divisions in France sounds impressive, until you realize that many of the garrisons were understaffed. With men deemed unfit for service on the Russian front, the fittest soldiers were removed and sent east, leaving behind a motley mix of older men, those with health problems, and conscripts from occupied countries who had no desire to fight for Germany. The quality of German forces in France varied greatly. Elite SS panzer divisions, such as the 12th SS and 1st SS, existed alongside stationary infantry divisions, which lacked transportation, proper training, and often even weapons. Some units were equipped with weapons captured from France, the Soviet Union, or the Czech Republic, creating a logistical nightmare. Getting the right ammunition to the right unit at the right time became a problem. At the operational level, the divided command structure meant Germany could never mount a unified response to the invasion. Rommel wanted the panzers close to the beaches. Von Rundstedt wanted them pinned down. Hitler divided but pleased no one. As a result, the most powerful weapon in the German arsenal, the panzer divisions, were scattered and unable to concentrate on the decisive point. Worse still, requiring Hitler to personally approve the mobilization of reserves meant that decisions were made by a man hundreds of miles from the battlefield, working with incomplete information, increasingly paranoid and detached from reality. Modern military forces require rapid decision-making and decentralized command. Hitler's system ensured the opposite: slow, deliberate responses carried out by an increasingly unstable individual. Tactically, the Germans in Normandy faced an impossible task. Allied air superiority was so overwhelming that German movement during the day was suicidal. Supply trucks, ammunition convoys, reinforcement convoys were all targets for Allied fighter bombers. The Germans adapted by moving only at night, but this slowed everything to a crawl. A panzer division that should have reached the front in 6 hours took 3 days. Exhausted and undermanned, The German defenders also faced a serious imbalance of firepower. The Allies could call upon naval firepower from battleships and cruisers offshore. They had large field artillery batteries, always well stocked with ammunition. They also had air support whenever the weather permitted. A German stronghold that held out too long would be easily flattened by massed fire. German soldiers, even the best of them, quickly learned that courage and skill were no match for the weight of explosives the Allies could bring. But perhaps the most fundamental reason for Germany's defeat on D-Day was that by June 1944, Germany had lost the war. The Eastern Front had destroyed Germany's best forces. The Battle of Kursk in 1943 had broken the backbone of the Panzer Army. The vast expanses of Russia had swallowed division after division. What remained in France were remnants, reserves, and second reserves. They were expected to withstand the full industrial might of the United States and Britain. With insufficient numbers, fragmented command, and no air support, the Atlantic Wall was a propaganda fiction. The Germans knew it. Rommel's frantic efforts to fortify it in early 1944 were an attempt to create something real from myth. But there was never enough time, never enough concrete, never enough mines, never enough troops. The wall that was supposed to protect Europe from invasion was a flimsy shell that crumbled under the first decisive blow. Germany's defeat on D-Day was not the result of brilliant Allied tactics, although the planning for Overlord was indeed brilliant. Nor was it the result of German cowardice, for German soldiers at every level fought with courage and determination. The defeat was structural, strategic, and inevitable. Germany was trying to defend thousands of miles of coastline with inadequate forces, divided command, no air power, and a logistics system that was nearly impossible to operate under Allied air dominance. Hitler had promised his troops that the invasion would be defeated on the beaches. He had promised that a powerful counterattack would push the Allies back to Britain. He had promised that D-Day would be Germany's opportunity, not its doom. Every promise was a lie, and to some extent the German commanders knew it. Rommel knew it, which is why he fought so hard to create defenses that could, very possibly, stop the Allies on the coast. Von Rundstedt knew it, which is why he wanted to preserve his panzer forces for a decisive battle rather than waste them on futile counterattacks. But knowing that the war was lost and being able to say so were two very different things in a totalitarian state. German generals who showed defeatist attitudes risked capture, or worse, so they continued to fight, sending young men to their deaths in unwinnable battles, defending a regime that would only bring ruin to Germany and Europe. The men who landed on D-Day, on both sides, were largely brave. They had done the job as they knew it. But the system that had brought them there, the decisions made at German headquarters, and Hitler's retreat into the mountains, had squandered German courage. The compromised command structure, the dispersal of forces, Hitler's intervention, the deception about Calais, the lack of air power, all combined to create a situation where German defeat was not only likely, but certain. On 7 June, with the Allied bridgehead extended and German counterattacks failing, Rommel sent a message to his superiors. He reported that the situation was dire. Allied air superiority made movement almost impossible. Panzer divisions were being destroyed piecemeal. Without immediate reinforcements and a coordinated counterattack with all available armor, the invasion would not be stopped. The response he received was silence. Hitler still believed Calais was the real objective. The reserves would not be liberated. Rommel was not a man to despair, but in those June days he must have felt it creeping in. All his predictions had come true. The Allies had landed in overwhelming force. The Germans had failed to repel them in the crucial first hours. Now Allied firepower was crushing any German counterattack. and the High Command, paralyzed by confrontational strategies and Hitler's intervention, was unable or unwilling to send the reinforcements needed to turn the tide. By mid-June, the tide of the battle had changed radically. The Germans were no longer trying to push the Allies into the sea. They were trying to control a beachhead to prevent a breakthrough into the French interior. This was a purely defensive battle, one that Germany could not win but could delay, and delay was all they could hope for now. The city of Caen, which was expected to fall on D-Day, became a symbol of the brutal war of attrition that now characterized Normandy. British and Canadian troops tried repeatedly to take the city. The Germans, holding out and fighting with desperate determination, pushed them back. The city became a morgue. Artillery reduced entire neighborhoods to rubble. Tank battles raged through the streets. Civilians crammed into cellars, praying for the nightmare to end. Caen did not fall completely until mid-July, 6 weeks after D-Day. By then, the city was in ruins, its ancient churches collapsed, its medieval quarter destroyed. Thousands of French civilians had died in the battle. Caught between German defenders and Allied fire, the liberation they had longed for had come at a high price. For the German soldiers fighting in Normandy, the experience was terrifying. They fought under constant air threat. Allied fighter bombers, known to the Germans as Jabots, attacked anything that moved. Supply became increasingly difficult. Ammunition, food, and medical supplies all had to be transported at night over roads and rail lines targeted by Allied aircraft and French saboteurs. Casualty rates were horrendous. Companies that landed on the beaches with 120 men were reduced to 30 or 40 within days. Replacements, when they arrived, were often poorly trained boys or old men pulled from duty in the rear. The psychological damage was equally severe. German soldiers in Normandy could see the vast Allied supply network. They saw a constant stream of ships landing troops and supplies. They saw Allied tanks and vehicles, newer and more numerous than their own. They felt the weight of Allied artillery, pounding day and night, ever ready to wipe out any exposed German position. And deep down, they knew they were fighting a losing battle. Some continued to believe in Nazi propaganda, in miracle weapons that would turn the tide, in political solutions that would divide the Allies. Others fought simply because they were soldiers, and it was their duty. Many fought because they feared what would happen to their families if Germany lost. Knowing that the Red Army was advancing from the east with the intention of revenge, and some, especially the fanatical SS, fought because they had committed such atrocities in the east that surrendering meant execution. But faith, duty, fear, and fanaticism could not overcome mathematics. The Allies landed 850,000 troops and 150,000 vehicles in Normandy in the first month after D-Day. German reinforcements, weakened by air attacks along the way, gradually arrived. By the end of July, the Allies had absolute superiority in numbers, firepower, supplies, and air support. The German army in Normandy was exhausted, holding out with only a fierce will to fight, but no hope of victory. Operation Cobra, the American breakout from the beaches of Normandy, began on July 25th. After a massive air raid that dropped more than 4,000 tons of explosives on German positions, American tanks poured through the gap. The German defense line, already strained to the point of collapse, finally collapsed. American tanks rushed into the French interior, liberating town by town, encircling and destroying German units that could not retreat fast enough. Hitler, true to his character, ordered his remaining forces in Normandy to counterattack and cut off the American advance. The result was the Falaise Pocket, where the remnants of the German army in Normandy were surrounded and destroyed. Tens of thousands of German soldiers were killed or captured. Thousands of vehicles, hundreds of tanks, and irreplaceable equipment were lost. The roads through the pocket were strewn with human and animal corpses, destroyed vehicles, and abandoned equipment. Allied soldiers who witnessed the scene described it as a hellish scene. For Germany, the destruction of Army Group B in Normandy was a disaster from which it never recovered. The Western Front, which was supposed to stop the Allies, collapsed completely. Paris fell on August 25th. By September, the Allies were close to the German border. The war, which Hitler had promised would turn in Germany's favor after defeating the invasion, was in fact accelerating the process that led to Germany's total defeat. Rommel did not live to see the final collapse. In July, his troop transport was bombed by Allied aircraft. Badly wounded, he was recovering when his involvement in the July 20th plot to assassinate Hitler was discovered. Given the choice between a public trial and execution or suicide, Rommel took poison in October 1944. The Desert Fox, the commander who understood better than anyone what Germany needed to do to prevent D-Day, became another victim of Hitler's paranoid regime. The question that haunts historians is what might have happened if Germany had followed Rommel's advice. What if the panzer tanks had been positioned close to the coast? What if they had been allowed to counterattack immediately without waiting for Hitler's approval? What if German commanders had been given free rein to react quickly to the invasion? The answer, almost certainly, is that it didn't matter. Nazi Germany in June 1944 simply lacked the resources to defeat Operation Overlord. Allied air superiority alone would have been enough to crush any German counterattack. No matter how well positioned or how quickly deployed, Allied naval firepower would have been enough to disrupt any German armored concentration. And the sheer scale of the invasion, 56,000 troops on the first day alone, was too much for the already weakened German forces in France to withstand. Rommel's strategy might have made D-Day more costly for the Allies. It might have prolonged the battle for the coast. But in the end, the result would have been the same. Germany would have lost because Germany was losing. D-Day was not the turning point that changed everything. The real turning points came earlier, at Stalingrad, at Kursk, in the skies over Germany, where the Luftwaffe was systematically destroyed. By June 1944, Germany was a weak power. Trying to contain two superpowers and one empire, the math was wrong. Germany's defeat on D-Day revealed the hollowness at the core of the Nazi regime. Despite all the propaganda about German superiority and military genius, the reality of the war revealed a leadership that was divided, incompetent, and increasingly out of touch with reality. Hitler's interference in military affairs, his insistence on controlling every decision, his refusal to listen to experienced commanders all guaranteed defeat. The compromise on the Panzer was emblematic of a larger problem. Instead of choosing between competing strategies, Hitler tried to please everyone and ended up with a plan that made no sense. Instead of trusting his commanders to make decisions, he insisted on personal approval for major movements, causing disastrous delays. Instead of accepting the harsh reality of the German situation, he indulged in fantasies of miracle weapons and political miracles. The Germans paid the price for their failures of leadership. Young men like the teenage soldiers of the 12th SS Panzer Division charged into Allied positions with fanatical courage and were slaughtered by overwhelming firepower. Experienced tankers who had survived the Russian front were trapped in Normandy hedgerows, picked off one by Allied destroyers and planes. Infantry holding impossible positions fought until they were overwhelmed, killed, or captured, all to buy time for a counterattack that never came. The tragedy is that many of them fought for a cause that was morally corrupt and militarily defeated. The regime they served committed unspeakable atrocities across Europe. The war they fought was one of conquest and genocide. Their courage and sacrifice served an evil cause. Yet they were still human. Many of them conscripted out of choice, fighting because they were ordered to fight, and dying far away in a battle their leaders had lost. For the Allies, D-Day marked the beginning of the end. The successful invasion meant that Germany now faced a real war on two fronts, with no hope of victory. It meant the liberation of Western Europe had begun. It also meant the end of the Nazi regime. Within a year, Hitler would be dead and Germany would surrender unconditionally. But the victory came at a high price. More than 4,000 Allied soldiers died on D-Day. Thousands more were wounded or missing. The Battle of Normandy claimed more than 200,000 Allied lives before it was over. Each of those casualties represented a family back home who would receive a telegram. A personal tragedy wrapped up in the larger story of liberation and victory. The reason Germany failed on D-Day was not a single factor, but a combination of strategy gone awry, division in command, tactical incompetence at the highest levels, and simple math. Germany was trying to defend an empire with undersized forces, no air force, and a command structure that guaranteed slow, chaotic responses. They were led by a dictator who was losing control of reality, who believed in his own genius despite mounting evidence to the contrary. Rommel saw it coming. He tried to prepare. He begged for the resources and authority to properly handle the invasion. He was denied at every turn. And when D-Day came, everything he predicted came true. The Allies landed in overwhelming force. German counterattacks were too few and too late. Allied firepower smothered any German attempts to recover. The invasion succeeded because German failures made it inevitable. The legacy of D-Day was the liberation of Western Europe and the beginning of the final collapse of Nazi Germany. But the legacy of Germany's failures on D-Day is a lesson in how not to wage war. Separation of command fails. Micromanagement from distant headquarters fails. Refusal to accept reality fails. Fighting a war you cannot win with resources you do not have fails. Germany's defeat at Normandy was not a surprise or an accident. It was the inevitable consequence of years of bad decisions, strategic errors, and poor leadership. For the young men who fought and died on both sides of the Atlantic Wall. These strategic considerations meant nothing. They fought because they were there, because their friends were there, because it was their duty, or because they had no other choice. Their courage was real, even if the ideals they espoused were not. History remembers D-Day as a great victory and a devastating defeat. But for those who were there, it was simply the day their war reached its horrific climax on the beaches of Normandy. Germany failed on D-Day because defeat was built into every level of their war effort by June 1944. The question was never whether they would fail, but only how complete their defeat would be. The answer, written in blood across the fields of Normandy, was complete and absolute.